Hi, I'm Kerrie Penny, and on this episode of Secret Heart Broadcasting, I'm speaking with Susan Wismer, poet, wise woman, world traveler, mother, grandmother. She's turning 74 and has just published her first book of poetry. If you are interested in a conversation about courage and forgiveness and learning to be who you are meant to be in the world, then this episode is for you.
Because life at home was not easy, I was dying to get away. I begged to be sent to boarding school, and that wasn't on. So my opportunity to get away was to go away to university, which I was thrilled to do. And I had no idea, really. I applied to go to Queen's in Kingston, Ontario, because my best friend Rosemary was going there. And so I got accepted, and I was going to study music and English, I think, because in those days, well, I was a musician as a child, as a teenager. I still am, but that was a core piece of my life. And also, I always wanted to be a writer. And I got to university and discovered that I didn't want to take the music courses they had, and probably I wasn't good enough anyway, which is the way I thought about it then. And the English courses I took were like, no, they weren't going to teach me how to be a writer. Not a chance. They were probably going to take it all away. So after my first year, I did quit and decided that I was going to work for a while. And I did. I went out to Banff National Park and got a job in a campground there. And then it was by then the early 70s. And so at sometime in August, I quit and decided I was going to hitchhike out to the West Coast and go down to California, see what that was like. San Francisco was, a really important place for poets and writers. And of course, I did not inform my parents. What happened was that I got to Vancouver, where my grandmother lived, and had a moment of responsibility and thought, I should let her know I'm here. I should let them know. So I went and knocked on my grandmother's door, and my mother opened the door. It turned out that, this is in the days before smartphones and all kinds of stuff. So it turned out that my grandmother had fallen ill and my mother had gone out to support her. And so then my mother was able to sit down with me and have a little chat. Well, actually a big chat. What I did was I issued an ultimatum. I said, okay, I'll come back to Ontario and I will go back to school for one more year, but only if I can get into a journalism program. And at that point, there was a journalism program at Western, and I applied in mid or late August, which should have been far too late. And unfortunately or fortunately, I got in. So my second year was spent at the University of Western Ontario in journalism school, where I learned that at that time, life for a woman journalist was extremely difficult. Just really hard. You were either working for a very small regional paper writing up weddings and recipes, which I did not wish to do, or you gave up everything. You gave up family. The women I knew, many of them struggled with addiction, and I just thought I wasn't strong enough for that life. So after my second year, I quit again. Anyway, this went on for quite some time. It took me 7 years to get an undergraduate degree, and it was a 3-year undergrad. But then I worked, one of the places I worked was at the school, what was at that time, the School for the Deaf. It was a residential school in Milton, Ontario, and I was a residential counselor there. And after 9 months there, I knew I wanted more education. I knew that those kids needed more than I was able to provide with what I had. And I, in particular, got this perspective, in part from my mom, who I have to give a lot of credit to, that, a child is not isolated. If they are lucky enough to have a family, their family has a huge influence on them. And if the family has community, that community has a huge influence. And I just developed this perspective that working with communities was really, really critical for the well-being of children, which I still hold. Yeah. So back I went to school to get a undergraduate degree in psychology. And then I went to, did a master's degree in adult education and counseling. And along the way, dropped the counseling part, spent some years doing community development. Then I went back to school when I was 40. Was a rare, amazing, and silly decision, probably. I had one child already. I was pregnant with another. I thought, oh, yeah, I'll go back and do my PhD. Anyway, it was dumb, but it happened. And so I got a doctorate in regional planning, in large part because I really wanted to go overseas for a couple of years to work. Although that didn't unfold either, not until much later.
Okay, so along the way you did get married, or did you not get married?
I did. Oh, I got married at the age of 23, I think.
Oh, that's my daughter's age.
Lovely young man who turned out to have some alcohol issues. The marriage lasted 2 years and I left. And, that was part of my own education. My dad had alcohol problems, and I just realized I didn't have what it takes to live with a partner who has had a drinking problem. Not at that point. And I don't know. Yeah.
At some point in this story, then, you've got 2 young children, and you're going back to school to become Dr. Susan Wismer.
Yes. Well, after I separated from my youthful, unfortunate marriage, I had a number of years on my own. And then I got together with my children's father, David. And he and I were self-employed, working with doing various forms of community development work, social and community-based economic development planning, and a variety of things. And we had a couple kids, and that was good until it just seemed like we were going in very different directions. So at a certain point, we separated.
So you've had this ability to, because I know I can speak for myself, I guess, best of all. I hang on to things for too long. I hang on to relationships. I hang on to objects. And you seem to have this ability to realize this is not working and gently lay it down.
Not always as gently as I'd like, but I think that kind of fortitude, and I mean, on one hand, from my mom, you can do it. You can live the truth of who you are. If you really want something, you can go after it. And on the other hand, my father, who a difficult man, but he was like, I don't give a damn about what anybody thinks. And, the positive side of that is to really look inside and think, okay, what do I think here? And yes, other people's opinions matter, but they don't determine how I feel. So I had those things going for me, that when I realized that I was losing myself in some kind of situation that wasn't working for me, I knew it. And I think not everyone does.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. I love that you talked about living the truth of who you really are. So if we rewind back and we see young Susan who's like, Mom, I want to be a writer. And in the meantime, you have this life of, continuing education, you get your doctorate, you're running your own company. When did the writing piece kind of tap you on the shoulder again?
Well, I think it was with me all the time. I've been very fortunate. As a child, I just was amazed at language. I just like to be able to take what you see and what you think about, what you imagine, and shape it into words, into sound, and then find a way to write that down on, to learn how to translate those sounds into letters. It was an absolute miracle and fascinating and magical. And I never lost that. So throughout all my many different forms of education and employment, I did lots of different things for money. There was always a writing element, although not often, sometimes not very creative at all, but certainly I was always writing. But I mean, just in terms of living the truth of who I am, I think it's the poetry that does that for me. And at a certain point in my life, when my kids were young, I wrote maybe one poem a year. Like, I wasn't writing a lot of poetry, but I would still try. My goal was once a week. I never made it. Once a week to take myself out for breakfast with my journal, let somebody else serve me tea and eggs or whatever, and just sit there and write and see what came out. And that's how I knew. That's how I knew who I was. That's how I knew what my truth was. And once it's down there, it's kind of unavoidable. You just can't walk away from it.
Yeah, well, you can, but then you're into numbing, and maybe, there's lots of ways to walk away from the truth, but, they're harmful, I think, in my experience, right?
And I think, that was another thing growing up in the 50s and 60s. My dad, for all his weaknesses, was a very honest, truthful man. When he was angry, he was angry. When he was, calm, he was calm. When he had something to say, he said it. And given that he was very difficult to live with, that I appreciated that from the time I was a child, that at least I knew what was happening for him. And I could see all around me that lots of people had secrets, were trying to hide things, so even through the years where it was hard with my dad. But even through those years, I always appreciated his honesty, his truthfulness.
Was there ever a point in your life when you felt like you lost yourself? And I'm kind of mapping you out against that, Joseph Campbell hero's journey. But was there ever that point? Because in speaking now, I'm like, wow, Susan Wismer always really knew her truth.
I think, always is probably a really strong word. Mm-hmm. I think that sometimes it took me longer than others. My relationship with my children's father was very good in many ways. And he was and is an excellent dad. He had has a great sense of humor. We're friends. And had a lot to offer to the world. And at a certain point, it just wasn't working for me anymore. It took me quite a while to be able to face that in myself, because everybody thought we were perfect, and it wasn't all bad by any means. But I was shriveling up inside. I was becoming not who I am. I was, prone to depression and misery, and so I had to do something about that. And, having kids, as you probably know, does really help you to face the truth about yourself. It's one thing to allow myself to shrivel up and disappear, but to model that for my children, no, I wasn't willing to do that.
Yeah, I always say my daughter made me a better person, 100%. Thanks for listening. If you like the show, please tell your friends.